Hi guys, Justin from Fat Robot back again. So just to kind of like wrap up on the stuff that we were talking about with these wrap methods, that was a terrible unintentional pun. Um, uh, I just wanted to do something that would be really challenging. And sometimes at the end of these, I like to try to break things or see like what kind of crazy things we can do. This one doesn't break anything, but it kind of will cave your brain in. This took me a really long time to kind of be able to break down just for myself. And originally, so you'll notice here, um, if you watch the previous videos, um, this structure was a bit more complex originally. For one, I've made it look a lot nicer, just so it looks a bit friendlier, which I apologize. I probably should have done on those first videos. Um, but added some borders here so things are easier to see. I kind of highlighted these number names and I gave them different colors. So H1 number 1 is yellow, H1 number 2 is pink. Um, and then the other thing is, this used to have this whole other div that was nested in this first level div that had another H1 and two H2s in it. And originally, when I was setting this up, I had like all this crazy code going on with that whole thing. And as I tried to deconstruct it, I realized that really all I needed was this tiny little piece of code here and two H1s nested in this div. Anything beyond that, like, it gets kind of ridiculous. You'll see, like, when we try to break just this down, it's kind of, yeah, your brain will throb. um, so I think what I'm going to do at first is just going to take one of these H1s out so we can kind of break it down even simpler, and then we'll move on to with the two H1 tags. um, okay, so now all we have is a containing element, containing div, and an H1 tag. And this piece of code that we're going to use, it is going to use the jQuery function to select all H1 tags, which in our case is just one. And then it's going to say, and wrap that in the first div that you find. Now, if you remember back to like our prepend, append videos and stuff, you couldn't take like a parent element and prepend or append to a child element. And it's because it actually pops that out of the document. It moves it. Whereas the wrap method, if you remember, it doesn't actually move the original one out of the document. It makes a copy of it. So we can do that. We can take a parent element and say, wrap this parent element around this H1 that already has this parent element wrapped around it. Already things start sounding a little weird. And then the thing to keep in mind too with this wrap method is that it doesn't just wrap this div here. It wraps this div and brings along all the content contained within it. So all of it will get kind of wrapped around this, and the content within it becomes siblings of this. So let's just do this really simple one here so you can see what I'm talking about. We'll take that off. Okay, so kind of crazy, right? We have, here is our original div. And then down here, we have our original H1. But what basically happened is it took this original div and original H1 and then used that to wrap this original H1. So you have a clone of this div and a clone of this H1. So the clone of this div becomes this H1's new immediate parent, and the clone of itself becomes its sibling. So let that sink in for a minute, because that's already a little weird. And then there's so much further you can go with this, but just, I mean, this took me so long just to break this down just with these two things. So I'm not going to go too crazy with it. I'm actually just going to add one more h1 into the mix, and we will call that good and try to break it down as best we can. And again, it's really kind of hard to explain clearly, but if you spend enough time staring at it, it makes sense. So I've turned this off. Okay, so now we've got our containing div, our first h1 element, our second h1 element. So that jQuery function is going to select the first h1. It's going to say wrap it in the first div that you find along with all of its contents. So the first div that it finds, again, is the already containing parent. And so it's going to wrap this h1 in a copy of this, and then it's also going to bring along all of the contents as siblings. So these two h1s are now going to be siblings of the original h1. So let's just focus on that part right now. More is going to happen than this because I can't just like run this function partially. It'd be nice if I could. There probably is like some way through, if I was better at coding. I'm sure it's probably not that hard to like tell it to stop at a certain point, but okay guys, we're back. Yeah, that is like totally easy to do that, and I actually knew how to do it and just kind of forgot I knew how to do it. But yeah, that should appease some of the people who were probably screaming at their computer screens as I said that like, I don't really know how to do this. And yeah, it's really easy. Basically, so I've just set up this extra code block here that will run this, basically this same function, but it'll just do it once. So where this would run two different iterations because we have two h1 tags, right? So it runs a full iteration for one and a full iteration for that second tag. This one will just run one full iteration, so basically just for this first h1 tag. And if you're curious how I did that, I use this each method that comes with jQuery where basically you can say for each one of these things do this thing, and we stuck a function in here, and so it grabs the first h1, it says for that thing do this function, and in the function I have a simple while loop, and over here I've declared a variable I equal to 1, and I'm saying will I is less than or equal to 1. This, which refers to that first h1 element, dot wrap div, and that's going to wrap it in this div along with its contents. And then it increments I, making I equal to 2, so I is no longer less than or equal to 1, and we break out of that loop. So just kind of a quick, easy way to make that run one time. So let's take a look at what that does. Uncomment this. Okay, so there we go. So basically what happened here, it took this original first level div, and inside of that original first level div, if you remember, we had an h1 element here and another h1, and I apologize if I end up referring to this as h2. I have a bad habit of referring to this h1 number 2 as an h2, but these are both h1s. But so basically these two were originally together in this outer first level div, but now this is going through and it's wrapping just this first h1 that we originally had, and it's wrapping it with what we originally had. So it wraps it in this div, basically a clone of that. So that's what this is. This is a clone of that div. And remember that brings all of its contents with it. And so its contents were an h1 and an h2. So now there's a clone of itself in here, as well as a clone of this original h2. And at this point in the loop, since this is only ran once, it's only ran for that first h1 tag, this other h1 is kind of sitting outside of this still, because nothing has happened to that yet. So kind of all the action is right in here. But so kind of crazy. So this div, clone of that, this h1, clone of that h1, this h1, clone of that h1. So digest that for a minute. And we're just going to do one last thing, which is we're going to run the full loop. So basically it'll do what you just saw, but then it'll move to the next iteration of the loop where it then goes back and redoes all that for this second h1. And you'll see things get pretty crazy when it goes back and does it again. Again, like I had set this up like way crazier at first, and then I realized like just something this simple, it can get really complicated. So we're just going to leave it at this. So uncomment that. Okay, now things look kind of bonkers. So again, here is our original first level div. This is the actual one that has been cloned numerous times throughout this. Now here is our original h1 tag right here. It's the first time this loop ran. If you remember what we just looked at, it just took this first level div that originally just contained an h1 and h2. It made a clone of that. It wrapped this original h1 div with that, and so now it's a clone of that div, a clone of that h1, and a clone of that h2, which now is like way further down at the bottom because we have all this other stuff going on. And so what is all that other stuff going on? Well, now it's moved to... So what is all that other stuff going on? Well, basically now this is finished wrapping that first h1 tag. So it kind of completed this whole process here for the first h1 tag. Now it's going to jump forward to the second h1 tag. And again, it is going to say wrap that tag in the first div that you find. Well, now at this point, again, the first div that it finds is still this outermost div, our original div. But now, again, it takes all the contents of that with it and uses that to also wrap the selected element. And so now we have a clone of this original div inside of it, along with a clone of the original h1 element and a clone of the h2 element, or excuse me, the second h1 element that is now being wrapped. All right, so a clone of the original h1 right here, the first one, and a clone of the second h1, which is now like way down at the bottom. So now it's going to take all of this and use that to wrap that h2. So basically, if we look down here, so you can see where this green is here, still our original div container. And then here we have a new clone of that div container. And then in here we have a clone of the div container that we got on the first iteration of the loop, right? So original, here's our newest clone, and here is a clone of the first clone div container. So that first clone div container is going to be cloned exactly like we saw it at the end of the last loop, right? So it's that first level div, you have h1, h2, h1. That's just a copy of this whole thing here, right? And then we also have a copy of this outer div now, wrapping that still within this div. And we look down here, now we have two different h1 tags that are these second elements. Well, remember, we still have that one hanging out by itself. And so that is getting wrapped, but also when this thing went and looked for the first div to wrap that h1, that second h1 with, this other h1 was already here. And so again, it brings all of the contents along with it. So it's basically, there's a clone of that. Same way that we had with the the first h1 tags. So yeah, it's pretty crazy. But to break it down, this right here is the original div container. This right here is the original h1 number 2 tag. And then this one right here is the original h1 number 1 tag. This is the first clone of the original h1 tag. This is the first clone of the second original h1 tag. All right, and this is the first clone of the containing div. Here we have the second clone of the containing div. Here we have the first clone of the first clone of the containing div. We have the first. Oh man, how do I want to say it? I guess this would be like the third clone of the first h1 tag. This would be the fourth clone of the first h1 tag. This is the, oh boy, second clone of the second h1 tag. This is the third clone of the second h1 tag. Holy crap, I can't believe I actually got through that kind of. So you can see how quickly this becomes really, really, really complicated. And if you want to totally fry your brain on this, I will link to this code pen, and you can try to add just a couple more things to that and see if you can follow it all the way down, because it's really, really difficult. But yeah, so until next time, guys, try to give your brain some rest, I guess.